The Last of Us is one of those rare gems in gaming that truly pushed the medium forward. It may not have been perfect gameplay wise, and because of that it definitely suffered from some pacing issues here and there, but overall the game is an absolute masterclass at how to make an enticing and impactful story within a video game format. From the emotionally complex characters to a alluring open world, The Last of Us was one of the first clear examples of how a video game story and characters could truly connect with players without losing the elements that still make a game fun. One problem with having a game this highly beloved though is figuring out how to follow it up. You make the same game with some slight changes, a completely different game that has very little in common with the original, or do you just make some profitable remasters and remakes? Well, Naughty Dog decided to choose a fourth option, all of the above. The Last of Us 2 from a gameplay perspective is similar to the original with some much needed improvements and extra details. For example, combat in the original feels pretty brutal at times, but the second game takes it to a whole other level, adding comprehensive dismemberment with grim sound effects to boot, and even going out of their way to add unique voice lines for enemies whenever you kill their friends. All this added gore and detail really contributes to the substantially darker tone this game has compared to the first. And unlike a lot of other single player shooters, it doesn't feel like you're just killing the same soulless AI enemies over and over again. Instead, it feels more personal, which works perfectly with the game's overall theme. The combat itself also feels much smoother and refined compared to the first game, adding pretty much all the same weapons with a couple new additions like the crossbow and submachine gun, and adding some more tactical ways of fighting with a trap mine and stun bomb. One major change combat wise though is the ability to go prone, which helps make stealth feel a lot more complex, since you now have another movement and stealth option other than just running or crouching. And the added layer of level design here takes full advantage of that. But of course the combat would be nowhere near as satisfying without these environments you fight within. The level design is a massive step up from the original, as each area you roam through has a massive region to explore, which just builds upon the immense realism the game already possesses. Of course, one last major upgrade made gameplay wise was the graphics. It's not exactly surprising that this game would look as beautiful as it does, but what's impressive is that they managed to make the game run on a PS4, cementing it as one of the best looking games to release on the console, if not the best. And it is one of the clearest examples of how much technology has advanced between console generations. So it's clear that in terms of sheer gameplay, The Last of Us 2 was a massive step up compared to the first game. I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea and think that I'm mistaking the gameplay as being the lackluster aspect of this game, because it's not. The story, on the other hand, the story for The Last of Us 2 has to be one of the most controversial stories to ever be told in a video game. Some people love it and some people hate it, and of course with high controversy also comes high interest, which is partly why I find it so intriguing to analyse, and mainly why I'm making this video in the first place. But from the title alone, you already know my take on the story. I'm definitely more on the hate side, especially when I first play the game, and I'll explain why. So to begin, we should probably start with the biggest bombshell in this game, Joel's death. The majority of people watching this video are probably expecting that decision to be the main reason I dislike The Last of Us 2's story, but it's actually not. At least not fully. Don't get me wrong, when I first played the game, it certainly was a major aspect I hated, which is pretty much unavoidable when you loved the first game and Joel's character development throughout it. But looking back at the game with more clarity and after fully experiencing the rest of the story, I wouldn't say it was a bad decision to kill off Joel. Throughout the first game, Joel goes through all the character beats that completed his character. There really wasn't many directions to take Joel's character afterwards. At least, none that would leave anywhere near as much of an effect as the first did. It only made sense to focus on Ellie for this game, and losing Joel was the best way to do so. And if we're being honest here, it was kind of expected that someone would eventually get revenge on Joel for what he did. Let's not forget, he did take the potential zombie cure from the Fireflies and killed the majority of their people, including their leader. It would be pretty strange if he went the rest of his life without facing any repercussions for that. And that's not even talking about the moral side of it and whether he deserves repercussions or not. So the idea of Joel being killed is completely fine as a concept. The real problem I have with it is the execution. The first problem for me lies with how it happens, with him saving Abby moments from death just to be killed by her later on. Now, one pet peeve of mine is when a game that is clearly focused on realism has something extremely important but also extremely unrealistic happen. It's fair enough if it's something that happens repeatedly, and a game can obviously be unrealistic but also completely serious at times too, but when a game is centered on realism and has a generally serious tone throughout the game, like The Last of Us 2 does. It just bugs me to have something so unlikely happen. So you're telling me Joel and Tommy just so happened to be out scavenging and happened to come across the main person who's trying to find them just before they were about to be killed? Okay, man. Another aspect I hated about Joel's death was the deceptive marketing Naughty Dog advertised about Joel during the lead up to the game, to the point where they were adding Joel to late game cutscenes to trick people into thinking he was in the entire game.
What the hell are you doing here?
You think I'd let you do this on your own?
And even aging him in flashbacks that were in the game. But probably the worst aspect of Joel's death for me is how they kill him. Having Abby shoot his leg with a shotgun to cripple him, going out of her way to stop him from bleeding out, and then gradually killing him with a golf club. Being ganged up on by a group of strangers and beaten to death in that way is just extremely brutal. And killing Joel in this way is obviously purposeful to build as much shock and resentment towards Abby as possible, which definitely works in the game's favour for the first half, but truly backfires after Abby's side is introduced. I feel like if they had her just shoot him or get it over with quickly, it may have made forgiving Abby's character later in the game, like the game is clearly wanting you to do, a lot easier and more natural for players. But we'll talk more about that later. The next topic I want to talk about are the characters, because if you're going to kill off Joel, you better make sure you have some interesting new characters to make up for his absence. Now the characters in The Last of Us 2 aren't bad, but I would say the majority of them were way too underutilized. For example, Jesse was a very likable character that helps you throughout a good portion of the game, but there was never something he said or done that was all that impactful to the overall story. And after you find out Ellie's love interest Dina is pregnant with Jesse's baby, but loves Ellie instead of him, it was pretty predictable that he was going to be killed off. Dina was pretty likable at the start of the game, but slowly became the complete opposite for me as the game progressed. She basically puts not just herself, but also her and Jesse's unborn baby at major risk multiple times throughout the story just to help Ellie. Sure, it shows she's a loyal friend, that she does truly love Ellie, but also that she's extremely reckless. Risking her life and her unborn child is bad enough, but choosing to continue to do so after the baby's father has died, and Ellie has told her multiple times to head back home, is just flat out stupid. And don't even get me started about how she then gets on her high horse towards the end of the game, threatening to take the baby and leave Ellie if she goes after Abby again. Where was this urgency when you were having the baby? Fuck's sake, man. Like, what? Although Joel was killed off early on, we did still have his brother Tommy, and in my opinion they absolutely butchered his character in this game. During the first game, Tommy was a very loyal but sensible character. From the beginning it was clear that Tommy was very family focused and would do anything to help his family survive. But during the many years away from Joel, he found a community of people that he could protect and help, and over time they became another family for him to truly care for. So much so that it took a lot of convincing for Tommy to even think about helping Joel again over his community after all those years apart. During the scenes between Joel and Tommy in the first game, it's made abundantly clear that they're completely different to each other. Tommy is more hope-driven and sympathetic, while Joel's more barbaric and determined. But in the second game, it's like Tommy is just used as a complete replacement to Joel. So much so that it feels like he's adopted all his tendencies instead of adopting them naturally. Yes, he obviously cared a lot about Joel, and him dying is going to impact him dramatically, but he also cares about Ellie, his community, and his wife. But instead, he decides to become John Wick and starts obliterating everyone in his way to get to Abby. Now, don't get me wrong, he's a complete badass in this game, and while playing Abby, it feels like you're being pursued by the fucking boogeyman whenever he appears, but the actions he takes just don't really feel in character for him. And what's definitely not in character is him turning up to Ellie's house near the end of the game and trying to convince her to still get revenge on Abby, despite having a family that clearly needs her to stay, which he of anyone should understand. This was by far one of the wildest character switch-ups I've seen in a game, and I just hated it. It completely goes against all of his character motivations in the first game and turns him into such an unlikable character by the end. Yes, his brother was killed, but Tommy was not Joel. If it was the other way around, I'm sure even Joel would have second thoughts about hunting Abby by himself instead of staying to keep Ellie safe, and certainly wouldn't end up making her feel bad for not helping. Also, I want to quickly mention how stupid his injury was towards the end end of the game. You're telling me Tommy survived this shot to the head without bleeding out or dying on the spot? No wonder Tommy's character seems different. He's been replaced by a fucking Terminator. Now, on a more positive note, Lev is actually a pretty well developed character. Their dynamic between Abby is interesting since they're basically part of two different groups that have been killing each other for years, yet they still build a bond and learn to trust each other from the dire situations they both find themselves in. The heartwarming kind of friendship between the two that helps both characters grow, similar to Joel and Ellie's dynamic in the first game, which is clearly trying to mimic to an extent. I just like the concept of two characters that are supposed to be enemies finding similarities and good faith in each other, especially in a setting where there's not much to be hopeful for, and I think for the most part it was done really well here. But now we move on to my biggest gripe with this game, which is the pacing and more importantly the sequence of events, because this game genuinely makes no sense when it comes to the order it plays out. Now the game starts off strong having you control Joel, which is a perfect introduction for players of the first game since it's immediately giving you a familiar feel. It is also a perfect introduction to the stunning visuals and instantly shows you how much they've evolved compared to the first game. You also get some flashbacks which give the players more context to the current story and basically just gives fans of the first more content they'll love. But then we start playing a character everyone's unfamiliar with, Abby, and this is where the pace of the game really takes a nosedive. I don't mind the mystery of playing a character you don't know, and I think the way it was implemented into the main story was executed fairly well, but it was just so slow getting there. In the first chunk of gameplay of Abby, you're just roaming around for a while learning the controls, not even knowing what you're supposed to be looking for. Then you eventually go back to playing Ellie for an hour, which completely separates you from Abby again since you knew nothing about her beforehand. Then just when the story is starting to gain some momentum on Ellie's side, you go right back to Abby again, where unlike Ellie, you have no known goal or connection to the character. These switches to Abby just felt so out of place and tedious early on, but at least it still had some mystery behind it to keep most players' attention. But the worst part of the game when it comes to its order is when we start seeing Abby's backstory, which isn't shown before she smashes up Joel's skull, or shortly after, but instead halfway through the damn game. After playing in Ellie's perspective and seeing the emotional aftermath of Joel's death, then spending hours upon hours killing guards and hunting for clues to Abby's location to get revenge, now you decide to show Abby's side? Even killing Jesse, who like I said earlier was a very likable character, moments before showing Abby's side of events. It's just so baffling to me. The order and execution of Joel's death and the many hours after in Ellie's shoes make it almost impossible to fully sympathize with Abby. But at the same time, the game ends with the writers clearly wanting you to sympathize with her, which I personally didn't, especially on my first playthrough. Even after being able to sympathize with the character a bit more in hindsight, I still think the ending of this game is horrible. Clearly the story of this game is intentionally heartbreaking and brutal to play through, which is fine, but I just don't think it works towards a lesson or goal well enough to justify that. And the segments used to help try and force the player's perspective to be in Abby's favour by the end of the game are extremely biased and just feel forced. The clearest example of this was the scene of Ellie killing Abby's dog, which is a cutscene you are forced to do and even has Ellie say "stupid dog" after killing it, which feels extremely out of character and a bit overkill, to be honest. But then on Abby's side, you play fetch with this dog multiple times and are shown to care a lot for it. Another example is when you save a zebra as Abby, showing Abby as once again being a very thoughtful and caring person towards animals, while with Ellie, all you ever see is her killing them, which you can't exactly avoid doing when they are out to kill her. Come to think of it, Ellie doesn't have one moment in this game where she actually helps an animal or saves a complete stranger, despite clearly having these morals in the first game, while Abby on the other hand is shown doing all she can to save Lev and their sister despite them being from an enemy group. And this is where we get to the final part of the game I don't like, the ending. Now when I said the game doesn't work towards a lesson or goal very well, I'm talking about its clear pursuit to convey the ferocious cycle of revenge and how killing one person will only lead to more deaths later on. But this game doesn't represent that message to me. If anything, it displays the opposite, that if you do pursue revenge, you should either commit to it or not at all. If Abby decided to commit to revenge and killed Ellie and Tommy after Joel, none of this would have happened. Same thing when she gets the opportunity to kill them again. Her not doing so does nothing but come back to haunt her. And it's the same with Ellie, as it's only when she decides to stop pursuing revenge the first time when she starts facing the consequences. But regardless, Ellie ends up not going through with killing Abby and breaking the cycle of revenge. Now I get that this is Ellie ending the cycle of revenge that Lev would most likely reignite, and finally finding forgiveness for Abby after all this time. But the way it plays out of Ellie about to leave on the boat, then deciding she does want Abby dead, then changing her mind once more, it just felt so poorly executed. Also, I just can't get over the idea of all those people dying in the process of Ellie's revenge just to end up sparing her and not them. And not even just sparing, but saving her. They must be fuming. Overall, the story of The Last of Us 2 is a miserable experience, especially for fans of the original. But it's also clearly intending to be. I may not have enjoyed it in its entirety, but that's not to say I hated everything about it. I liked the majority of the characters, some of the relationships between characters were developed well, and the flashbacks were incredible, and made for a good change of pace. But what's most clear about The Last of Us 2's story is how it flips the script and what people were expecting. Whether you loved it or hated it, you have to at least respect how interesting this made the game's narrative to think about and discuss.